Support for the Brewlosophy podcast comes from the following. Love to Brew is a national leader in homebrewing supplies, offering exclusive products such as East Coast yeast, TV taps, and Brewlosophy recipe kits, all with free shipping on orders over $75. When you need brewing ingredients or equipment, check out Love to Brew at love2brew.com. The best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world. Find everything from classics to modern favorites, as well as cool experimental varieties and a vast array of ingredients and gear at yakimavalleyhops.com. Welcome back to the 6th episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. I know 6 doesn't seem like much, but for us, it's kind of an important milestone. This was the episode that I had set up to be kind of the one where that reminded me that we were actually doing this thing and that we were going to move forward with the podcast and try to make it a more regular thing. And I'm excited to say that we've gotten the support that we've been looking for so far, both from people over at Patreon and people who are supporting us in other ways, like using the links that we have for places like Amazon and More Beer and LoveToBrew.com and all of the other great homebrew shops that you guys are already shopping at. Another way of support is through the people who are sponsoring this podcast directly. All of the wonderful folks out there who are serving you guys, your hops and all of your other ingredients and gear. So if it weren't for them, we wouldn't be here doing this episode 6, and we plan to bring you so many more. We're really looking forward to doing that. Before we get into the topic today, which I'm really excited to talk about, we've got a couple announcements to make, and the most important one of which has to do with who's joining me today on the show, Jake Houlihan. Jake, congratulations on becoming a new dad, my man.
Thanks, man. It's been an interesting week for sure. We had a baby boy last week, Saturday, so we've had him home for about a week now, and it's been interesting for sure. It's been amazing, totally life-changing, but it's definitely been interesting.
So how's the sleep going for you guys? It's
going better than I thought it would. Obviously my wife would probably think a little bit differently, but just kind of like wake up like a zombie, go change him, and fall back asleep.
Dude, get used to it. And if you plan on having more, I've got 3, and they came one after another. And I'm telling you, man, I remember when I was working in a hospital for a little bit a few years ago, and one of the nurses came in when he found out we were pregnant with my first, and he just said, congratulations, dude. Just a forewarning, you're not going to sleep for 5 years with every kid that you get. So for every kid, I'll transfer that wisdom on to you. Don't expect to get a really good night's sleep unless you're out of town, which does occasionally happen, thankfully. But don't expect to get a truly good night's sleep while you're home until your kids are at bare minimum 5 years old.
Oh. Well, I guess it's worth it in the end, but man, that sounds daunting.
Well, hey man, seriously, congratulations. I love it. I love that Brewlosophy is sort of populating the world with, hopefully future homebrewers and people who kind of carry on our legacy as beer nerds and brewing nerds. I think it's really sweet. Malcolm's got his little guy who's a couple months old now, and Ray's got some kids, and we're doing a pretty good job.
Yeah, exactly. And I even passed it back a generation. So my parents came to visit because of the new baby, and I got to brew with my dad yesterday, so that was pretty fun.
That is awesome. Has your dad ever brewed before?
No, he had not.
What was it like for him? What do you think of the whole process?
I think he was kind of blown away by it. He said, there's a lot more going on than I thought there would be. So
I've got a good buddy here in town, one of my neighbors. I've got 2 great neighbors. We're all kind of best friends who hang out all the time. And this one guy, Jersey, he decided out of the blue that he wanted to come to HomebrewCon. And so without really chatting with me, he bought tickets and we ended up on the same flight and all of this stuff. So he'll be coming out to HomebrewCon 2017 with us. But he had never brewed a batch. He just really likes the culture and he loves beer. And so I kind of forced him into brewing his very first batch a couple weeks ago. We just kegged the beer up. We'll actually be bringing some of that beer out to HomebrewCon with us. And you better believe that it's also an experiment. But it was kind of a similar experience. I thought it was going to be far easier for him to grasp some of the stuff that we do when we're making beer than it ended up being. So
it's like we're so ingrained in doing this now. It just it seems like second nature to us, and without taking that step back, we kind of forget to see that.
Absolutely, man. And it was kind of a refreshing thing watching him kind of fuddle around. I made him do basically everything in the process. It was kind of took me back to those days where it wasn't so ingrained, which was, it was pretty nice. Well, hey, we've got some announcements to make real quick before we get into the show. First off, the Brewlosophy store is now open. That's brewlosophy.com/store. You can go there to buy just a few things. And that's part of the reason I'm bringing it up now. Currently, we've got some really cool mesh back hats that are for sale, and we've got some stickers that you can pick up. All of our tasting glasses are out of stock. I've got some on order, and we're going to actually order a couple of different kinds. The thing about the tasting glasses, and I'm just sending this out there, if you want to buy a tasting glass and pay for the shipping for that tasting glass, and it's just one, by all means, go do. I sort of feel bad because the shipping ends up costing more than the glass does. But the cool thing is if you're picking up some other stuff, the shipping actually becomes more reasonable. So grab a few things. That'd be awesome. We are looking into moving sales of t-shirts and stuff off of Amazon and over onto into the actual Brewlosophy store. The problem with that is we've got quite a few designs. People wear quite a few different sizes. And we also want to offer the shirts in at least a few different colors. So right now what we're working on is the logistics and trying to analyze the sales statistics so far just to see which ones we really need to have on hand so that we're not out of stock too quickly. If you guys have any suggestions for other stuff you'd like to see us selling in the store that you think are pretty cool, let us know. I'm always willing to look at different types of merch that people actually want that are Brewlosophy branded. I think that's a lot of fun. For example, I got a recommendation just the other day that we should start selling pop sockets. If you guys haven't heard what these are, they're the little things that you attach to the back of your cell phone case that make it easier to hold. I don't know, kind of cool. Get our Brewtron logo on there. We also still have some Brewtility belts in the store as well. If you're interested in being really cool and wearing a belt on your waist. So go check it out, brewlosophy.com/store. HomebrewCon 2017 is coming up. Jake, you're going to be there. How excited are you to go?
I'm so pumped.
So 2017 HomebrewCon is going to be a blast over in Minneapolis. You still got time to buy tickets. You don't have much time though. And also you still have time to buy some tickets for the Chop and Brew Pre-Funk, which is going to be held at Insight Brewing. You don't want to miss it. I mean, if there's any way you can show up to Minneapolis a day early, get there on Wednesday the 14th, go to brewlosophy.com/prefunk2017. Click the link to buy your ticket. Last I checked, there were only 36 left out of 300. That's how many people are going to be there. It's going to be a rad party. You've all heard about it already, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we do have an awesome raffle with some incredible sponsors contributing prizes. I just plugged it all into a calculator, over $6,000 in prizes, it looks like. So go again, get your pre-funk tickets if you're planning on attending. You don't want to miss that one. Again, we're still collecting questions for Brew and A. So if you have any questions you want to ask us, that is not an experiment suggestion, please do. You can email me directly, marshall@brewlosophy.com, or you can go to any one of the places that we are regularly at online and ask your question to us directly there. That's totally fine. We're just compiling them all so that we have enough for an entire episode. Finally, I need to tell you all about an incredible giveaway being run by the fine folks over at Great Fermentations, where one very lucky person is going to win a Blickman Brew Easy for either 5 or 10 gallon batches, whatever you choose, with your choice between gas or electric. If you haven't heard of a Brew Easy, you need to Google it. It's a rad all-in-one brewing system made by Blickman Engineering, who everyone trusts, has all kinds of fun bells and whistles and whatnot. And on top of that, the winner's also going to receive free homebrewing ingredients for 15 years. That's right, 15 years of basically free homebrewed beer. That's a pretty good deal. To enter, simply complete the short form over at greatfermentations.com/brewlosophy, and be sure to check out all of the other great stuff Great Fermentations has to offer, such as their tasty sounding Dreamsicle Cream Ale recipe kit. How can that be bad? The winner of the Homebrew for Life giveaway is going to be announced the day of the awards ceremony over at HomebrewCon in Minneapolis. That's June 17th, so stay tuned if you enter. Cheers to Great Fermentations for running such a killer giveaway. They're an awesome business, really cool people who've been great to work with, and their 20 years in the business suggests they're doing something right. So again, that's greatfermentations.com/brewlosophy to enter for your chance to win Homebrew for Life. If you're looking for other ways to support Brewlosophy, you can head over to brewlosophy.com/support. We've got a whole list of affiliate links there that you can use when you're doing your shopping at places like Amazon, Love to Brew, Great Fermentations, More Beer, all of those great online homebrew shops that you're already shopping at. Use those links. We'll get a little kickback. It won't even change your shopping experience. You can also check out patreon.com/Brewlosophy to see how you can get rewarded for supporting us with as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/Brewlosophy. That'd be really awesome. We truly appreciate it. And it does allow us to bring you this content more often. And that's the goal. Okay, Jake, when we come back, we're going to be talking about what?
Secondary fermentation.
Secondary fermentation, or probably more precisely, transferring from primary fermenter to a secondary fermenter for all the myriad reasons people recommend, or at least used to recommend doing so. Stick with us. We'll be right back. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste time chilling work, which is why I use cleverly designed immersion chillers from Jaded Brewing. After some bad experiences with counterflow and plate chillers, I began the search for a more efficient chilling solution and discovered Jaded. That was nearly 4 years ago, and to this day, I continue to rely on the King Cobra and the Hydra to chill my wort in record time without the setup or cleaning hassle of other chillers. If you're looking for a way to optimize your brew day, I can't recommend Jaded chillers enough. Go see what they have to offer at jadedbrewing.com and let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Transferring to secondary fermenter. This is something that used to be I guess, quote unquote requirement in home brewing, but it seems like these days a lot of people are skipping this step, with some referring to it as almost unnecessary.
So when we talk about secondary fermentation as homebrewers, I think we kind of maybe mix up two different things here. So generally, when I see people talking about secondary in the homebrew sense, they're talking about transferring beer from the primary fermenter to another fermenter. Whether or not that's for bulk aging, clarification, maturation, or actual secondary fermentation, they're just calling it the same thing as if it were a secondary fermentation. So before we kind of jump into that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the literature defines primary fermentation and secondary fermentation as, before we kind of talk about the homebrew application and how some people are doing that. So to me, primary fermentation had really always meant, just fermenting my beer in its first fermenter, pitching that yeast, getting fermentation mostly done. So I went and looked up some of the actual definitions of what primary fermentation means. And really, it's the vessel that's used to ferment a beer after the boil and chilling is completed. Yeast is then added to the young wort, and then it's allowed to go through these various stages of fermentation. So the stages are kind of defined as lag time, which is that period between the time you pitch and the time we actually get fermentation. Low kreuzen and high kreuzen, which are when you start to see those bubbles appear, and then they get pretty massive and start boiling all over. And then when the kreuzen starts to collapse, and finally once it's gone. And then you only have like a little layer of kind of nasty looking stuff on the top. So that's really what we're going to talk about as primary fermentation, but before we move it to that secondary vessel. So then moving on from that, secondary fermentation, in terms of how the literature would talk about it, is moving that young beer that's in primary fermentation to a different vessel, tank, or in our case, a carboy. And they would do this by measuring the beer with a hydrometer and only transferring when there's still a certain amount of fermentable extract remaining, so that once it's in that new tank, it's actually still fermenting. And some of the purported benefits of doing this are that yeast can then be reharvested and repitched to subsequent beer production, so they can stay on their production schedule a little bit faster. The transferred vessel, the one that they're transferring into, can be of smaller stature, so it might take up less space than their primary fermenters, and they can push things through it faster. And then once it's in secondary, it's allowed to age, clarify, introduction of any type of fruit, wood, hops, anything else that could be going on that. And they really make a note to make sure to avoid oxygen when transferring to that. So that's kind of a little bit of background of what I could find in the literature on what primary and secondary fermentation, might be delineated as. But from a homebrew sense, when we talk about that, and I don't know if this is how you think of it too, Marshall, it seems like people just talk about moving that beer from that first fermentation vessel to another one, whether it's to put it on hops, to add fruit, just to let it sit and clarify, or maybe even age it for a few months, a year.
Yeah, I think so too. I think I think most people accept, and it's pretty obvious, that home brewing, for the most part, at least conventionally, the methods that we've adopted were hugely influenced by what we observed in different types of professional breweries. And, in most professional breweries, they've got a primary fermentation tank that they ferment in, and then they rack it over to something like a bright tank, which serves a couple of purposes, but many in some way, one of those purposes is going to be longer aging, which a natural function of age is going to be the precipitation of stuff in that beer to clarify it. And so, when I first bought my kit and I was getting ready to brew my first batch and I'm reading through the instructions, there was no, unequivocally you had to rack to a secondary fermenter. And I just accepted that as a part of the process. And when I was I remember talking to the dude at the homebrew shop, his name was Mars, about, why are we doing this? And the main thing he focused on at the time was clarification. And to me, it seems like, in that kind of us copycatting professional breweries, we kind of lost a little bit of what truly, that secondary aspect is for, to the point that we did start referring to it as secondary fermentation, when really it's just a secondary fermenter that we're transferring it to, because fermentation ostensibly is done at that point.
Right. I think that's something that I know, it seems like you and a few other people I've heard talk about it, kind of have a gripe with when people refer to this as secondary fermentation. It's really not. We're transferring a fully fermented beer to what would probably be considered, in a professional sense, a maturation tank, and we're letting it, lager, age, sit in our keezer, and get clear.
Right.
Just whatever that purpose may be.
Yeah. Well, and you look at nowadays in particular, and there's other vessels that we transfer to that we don't call secondary fermenters. One of them being a keg. For a lot of us these days, we're kegging our beer. I suppose it serves kind of a similar purpose in the sense that it does, the beer tends to get clearer when it's in there. But I would say that for me, I don't know, maybe 8 to 10 years ago, I started hearing a little bit of concern. Not concerned so much as people questioning the convention of racking to a secondary, in particular that it may not be as necessary. And there were reasons that these folks were arguing that point.
Right. I think a lot of the opponents of secondary, which, it's kind of a popular bandwagon to jump on these days, especially on the internets, when people ask about secondary fermentation, just to say it doesn't need to be done because of XYZ. And some of those things that they talk about really are, you're transferring a fully fermented beer to an unpurged tank. You risk oxidizing that beer, and whether or not oxidation of homebrew is perceivable, you do run that added risk, and I don't think people really want to do that too much to their beer. Also, just the risk of infection. Anytime you touch your beer, anytime you move it, transfer it, run it through a hose, that has to be sanitary. And if it's even the slightest bit not, you risk infecting that beer and ruining something that you spent all this time and money working to make. Totally.
My biggest concern when it comes to racking to a secondary fermenter absolutely has to be contamination. And at the same time, like you mentioned, the oxidation risk, the increased risk of oxidizing the beer that I just spent all this time fermenting. If I can get away with keeping my beer in a primary fermenter, which also just happens to be easier because you don't have to clean and sanitize a second vessel, then that to me, and if it's making better beer, or at least it reduces the risk of making a worse beer, then I'm all for it.
Right. Yeah, totally. But on the other hand too, secondary fermentation can have its benefits, and it can be useful, especially for those people that do fruited beers, things like sours. So you might want to make your base beer in your regular fermenter that has a lot of headspace to let everything foam up and get down without risk of explosion. But then you might want to go and sit on fruit or wood or on some microbes for a few weeks, a few months, a year or so. And then maybe you do actually want to transfer to a smaller vessel that has less oxygen exposure potentially, and just put it away in a closet or put it away in your basement and let it sit for a while. Let the yeast consume any sugars you added, and then come back to it in a while and taste it.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the biggest arguments. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't still sort of question what bad could go wrong from, say, adding additives or adjuncts or fruit or whatever else directly to a primary. And I've got some anecdotal, experiences with doing that. But I definitely, to me, it's almost like weighing the risk. If autolysis is one of the risks that we have of leaving beer on yeast too long, and contamination and oxidation is the risk that we run by transferring that beer out of primary and into a secondary. To me, which one, if I've got a big old, Russian Imperial Stout that I want to bulk age for a year, which one is it? Right. And I want to put it on oak or something. Do I want to run the risk of oxidation and contamination? Do I want to run the risk of potential autolysis or whatever else can go wrong by leaving it in primary?
Well, I know me personally, I'd rather run the risk of autolysis because I'm not sure I've ever actually experienced that in my homebrew.
Oh my God. Go burn some tire rubber, man, or lick a raw steak. Those are the things that I've experienced when I believe that I've tasted a beer that's had autolyzed yeast in it. Ugh. It's not good. Yeah. But yeah, I definitely see if those things are, and we're going to agree that they're real, autolysis is real and contamination is real. But with that understanding, like I said, to me, it's sort of a weighing of the risks. Do I really want to do that? I think what we need to get back to here, though, is that we've been told for so long that transferring to a secondary fermenter, I'm curious to hear how, when you started homebrewing, what it was like, because I know it was a bit after me. But for me, it was like, you ferment in primary, pitch your yeast, let that yeast ferment for 7 to 10 days, rack it over to a secondary fermenter and let it sit for 3 weeks, rack it into your bottles, your bottling bucket, bottle that beer up, and then let them sit another 3 weeks. And I mean, one of the more off-putting elements to homebrewing when I first got into it was the fact that I wasn't drinking beer for, 6 to 8 weeks after I brewed it.
Yeah, I actually, I pulled up the first recipe kit sheet that I ever brewed today in preparation for this one. And it does say after 7 to 10 days, rack to secondary, where you leave it for another week. So yeah, that was only, a few years ago. So people are still getting that information. Oh no,
I was more power to the folks who are running these amazing homebrew shops out there. But I've noticed I've probably, we've had a few a sponsored kits sent out to us to use for experiments and stuff, and the instructions that they include in those kits still include at least as of about a year ago, they still seem to include the instructions to rack over to a secondary fermenter, not for secondary fermentation, but literally for clarification and whatever other reasons people contended that it was important to do so.
And I know that when I first started, for sure my thought in terms of doing secondary, which I did for a while, was that, I was just repeating what I had heard, that it's going to clarify the beer, which I never really observed. And you got to get it off that yeast cake right away, or else that yeast is going to turn meaty and gross.
Well, and the clarification thing was something that started to bug me as I really started to think about homebrewing, right? There's this cool thing called gravity. And in my mind, and I've heard people argue with me on this point very, very passionately. So I don't mean to offend anyone, but this is just my line of thought. Gravity works at a very specific and predictable way. I don't know the exact speed at which things drop, but stuff falls down, basically. That's not too hard to grasp. If I've got a primary fermenter and there's yeast and there's hop stuff and there, trub and all of the other stuff that is in beer, and fermentation is finished, that stuff is naturally going to precipitate and fall out, even a little bit quicker if we do it cold, right? Hence cold crashing. The argument that by racking that beer over to a secondary fermenter and letting it sit longer, that it's going to get clearer, I don't understand on a scientific level how that can be. In fact, in my head, by letting that beer sit alone in the primary and not disturbing it, it would seem to me that it's going to be clearer at the time of racking to the secondary than that beer is going to be once it gets to secondary, because, naturally stuff is going to get stirred up during the racking process. And so once it's over in secondary, gravity is going to do the same exact thing it was doing to it when it was in primary, no?
Yeah, I totally agree. You think about it, I mean, sometimes you're told this stuff and you just start repeating it, but if you do actually sit back and think about that, it doesn't make any sense, because, each carboy is at the same exact sea level and gravity is working the same exact way on them.
Right. And I think anecdotally, we've all seen the pictures you take, and including the experiments that you do. Everyone has seen mine. I think for the most part, all of us people who are doing this thing for Brewlosophy have stopped using secondaries pretty much altogether.
And we still do get clear beer. I wonder if maybe, the clarity of secondary is kind of like you said, seeing commercial brewers and copying it, because, commercial German brewers are racking that from that primary to their secondary, which is going to be their lagering tank, and they're bringing that temperature down, and then they're letting it sit in there until it's clear. Maybe it doesn't actually aid in the clearing process, but that's what they're doing. So maybe that's what we thought we had to do.
Yeah, totally. And I think you mentioned lagering. There are certain scenarios where I can see secondary maybe making a little bit more sense. And while there are, lager aficionados out there who I know of who make great lager beer who don't rack over to a secondary, I can see for those who really enjoy engaging in the traditional lager brewing process, how doing so might again reduce that risk of maybe picking up some sort of an autolyzed yeast flavor, or even some sort of a grassy character from whatever hop remnants are remaining in the primary fermenter, getting it off that, letting it cold condition for a long time, lagering, I should say, in the secondary fermenter before packaging and kegging. I mean, there are these times where it seems to sort of make a little more sense, but the rule that you have to rack to a secondary in order to make the best beer for every beer that you're making on the homebrew scale, that's what I came to question.
Right, totally.
Well, and that's exactly why we did some of these experiments that we've done. And when we get back from this short break, we're going to get right into the experiment that I did comparing a dry hopped
rye ale.
Red rye, Roscoe's Red Rye Ale. My son helped me design this one. We're going to jump right into that experiment and talk a little bit about the results. We'll be right back. If, like me, you prefer the simpler side of brewing beer, you have got to check out the Brew Bag, a food-safe fabric filter that allows for mashing of the finest crushed grain without risking the dreaded stuck sparge. I've been recommending these things since I started using them. They are awesome. The Brew Bag offers the only completely reinforced fabric filter for brewing that can be used over 100 times and comes in sizes that fit most mash tuns, or you can even have one custom made. Go check the Brew Bag out at brewinabag.com and be sure to use promo code TBP17 to get 10% off your order of $30 or more. So way back in August of 2014, just a few months after the whole experiment series even started, I knew that if I was going to go forward with this, that I would have to test out this huge variable of transferring to a secondary. In my world, it just seemed like such a big thing. And I had already stopped transferring to a secondary pretty much altogether at this point, but I did wonder if there was anything I was missing. So I designed a really simple experiment where I made a red rye ale. It started off as a pale ale, and then my son asked me to add some rye and roasted barley. I figured, what the hell, may as well. And so we turned it into Roscoe's Rye Red Ale, or Roz's Rye Red Ale. It was actually pretty tasty. I brewed in a 10-gallon batch, same mash, same boil, split that chilled wort between two 6-gallon PET carboys, pitched them with the same amount of yeast, same type of yeast, let them ferment next to each other, just like we always do with these experiments. And then came the variable. After about a week of fermentation, I added the dry hops to the primary only batch, directly to the primary, no bag. They were added loosely. And with the other one, I added the dry hops to a sanitized 6-gallon PET carboy before racking the secondary beer on top of it, like you typically would with a transfer to a secondary fermenter. I let that go for another 11 days or so before the beers were done. And when they were done, I took hydrometer samples. Both were exactly at the same FG. No difference that I could note. And they looked about the same to my eye as well. Now, a little disclaimer, this was integrated before, or I did this experiment before we integrated the triangle test. So I don't have the data that I wish I had here, which is inspiring me to want to return to this variable, maybe with a logger or something like that. But what I do have is a bunch of interesting statistics about what the tasters did discover. And I'm just going to go through all of them here really quick. I think they're a little bit interesting. So I had 16 people participate in this experiment. 16 folks. They were blind to the variable. They were blind to what type of beer it was. All they did is they took a quick survey on their phones, answering some questions about appearance, aroma, flavor, and mouthfeel. Here's what they found. 63%, when it comes to appearance, found no difference in clarity, with 31% of people reporting that the primary only beer was clearer than the one transferred to secondary. Pretty telling. So most people thought it was equal clarity. Then right after that, 31% of people thought that the primary only beer was actually clearer than the one transferred to secondary. And only one person thought that the one that was transferred to secondary was clearer. Moving on, in terms of color, 63%, again, thought that there was no difference in color. 25% thought that the beer that was transferred to secondary was actually a little bit darker. So 4 out of these 16 people thought that the secondary beer was a little bit darker, which sort of makes sense if that was in fact true, because if oxidation is occurring, oxidation is known to have a darkening effect on beer. So I thought that was pretty interesting. That left 13% who thought the primary only beer was a little bit darker. 38% of these participants found no difference in head retention between the beers. Another 38% thought that the secondary beer had a little bit better head retention, while 25% thought that the primary only beer had better head retention. That's an interesting one to me because of the whole argument that there are lipids that could have an impact on head retention if the beer is left on the trube maybe a little bit longer. Is that something that makes...
It does make sense. I mean, I think that might be the difference of like 1.5 people there. But that does make sense.
I mean, actually, it's the difference of 0 because the same amount of people who thought the secondary beer had better head retention is the same amount who thought there was no difference in head retention. So I guess it kind of doesn't matter. I'm going to go with it probably wasn't any different. 69% of the participants in this experiment reported the general appearance of the beers to be exactly the same, while the remaining 31% thought that they were just somewhat similar. Okay. Overall, 50% found no difference in appearance, while 31% thought that the secondary beer looked better, and 19% thought that the primary only beer looked better. That is literally the difference of 2 people. So I'm not sure I'm going to say that they were much different in terms of appearance. Moving on to aroma. This is where things get a little bit fun because, in my opinion, if transferring to a secondary fermenter is going to something that you do when you're adding dry hops, and I remember people specifically telling me, you do not throw your dry hops into primary. You know, that's what you do secondaries for the aroma benefits. Then these ought to be pretty astoundingly, significant, right? So here we go. Aroma, 56% of people thought that the secondary beer had more malt aroma. 25% thought that the primary only beer had more malt aroma. And 19% thought there was no difference. 56% thought that the primary only beer had better hop aroma. 25% thought that the secondary beer had a stronger hop nose, and 19% found no difference. So right here, again, I didn't run this through a statistical equation or anything like that, but 50% of people thought that the beer dry hopped in primary only had a better hop aroma than the beer that was transferred over to a secondary. Pretty cool to me.
Yeah, that's interesting because, you think about, one of the potential negatives of secondary that we've talked about being oxidation, and that's known to kind of kill hop aroma. And so maybe people thought that it was a little bit more malty because some of that hop aroma may have been, destroyed.
Totally. That's a really interesting observation, actually. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but that kind of increase in malt aroma in the one that was transferred to secondary versus the increase in hop aroma versus for the primary only beer, they kind of could go together. I mean, and potentially it's because of both of them being a function of oxidation of some sort. In terms of ester and phenol aroma, both secondary only and primary only were pretty close. A lot of people thought there was no difference. Same thing with off or unpleasant aromas. No huge difference there. Let's see, 31% thought the secondary transfer beer had more off aromas than the primary only beer, with only 13% of people, which I think in this case was 2 people, thought that the primary only beer smelled less pleasant than the other one. That could be another function of oxidation, or it could just be that there was really no difference and people were guessing. Here's an interesting one. In terms of aroma, 94%, 15 out of 16 people reported that the general aroma of the beers was at least somewhat similar, with only one person saying that they were exactly the same. And as we know, people don't like to go to the extremes when they're taking surveys. So no big surprise there. These beers were essentially the same. I'd be doubtful on aroma alone that, and again, this is my opinion, but that people would have been able to reliably distinguish the primary only beer from the secondary beer. So let's move on to flavor. 44% found no difference in the malt flavor of the beer, with 31% saying that the secondary only beer was maltier in terms of flavor, and only 25% experiencing the primary only beer as being more malty. So pretty similar to the aroma one. 44%, the same 44% thought that the primary only beer had more hop flavor, with 38% saying there was no difference and 19% saying that the secondary beer was more hoppy tasting. No big surprise there. That when they align like that, it does seem to be that there's kind of a relationship that people are making in their minds between malt flavor and hop flavor, and it's kind of a negative correlation. Yeah. Yeah.
Like once they arrive on this one being maltier, this one being hoppier, it's just going to be that way throughout the entire survey.
Exactly. In terms of yeast and fermentation caused flavors, 47% found no difference. 33% thought the secondary beer had better yeast character, and 20% thought the primary only beer was better. So no big differences there. In terms of off flavors, 63% thought there was no differences. 25% thought the primary only beer maybe had a little bit more of an off flavor than the secondary transfer beer, which 13% of people thought there was a difference there, or that the secondary beer had more off flavors. And with these surveys, people are sort of forced to choose something, and so they kind of dig in a little bit deeper. I drink these beers a ton. I didn't notice any off flavors, and the people I served them to afterwards, when I was giving pints of beer away after the experiment, they were drinking them just fine too. So let's see the general flavor of the beers. 63% of people thought it was somewhat similar. Again, to say that they were exactly the same would be difficult for anyone comparing beers because that's not what our minds do. So 63% thought that they were somewhat similar. 25% said that they were exactly the same in terms of flavor overall, and 13% thought they weren't similar at all. So that's pretty interesting. Overall, 50% found no difference in flavor between the two beers. 38% thought the secondary beer tasted better, and 13% preferred, in terms of preference, preferred the primary only beer. So I'm not sure what to make of that one, because it seems like, a beer that has more hop aroma and less off flavors, or off aromas, I should say, that would be more preferred than the one that doesn't, but this is the way that people filled out the survey. So 50%, again, no difference in terms of preference when it comes to flavor. 38% thought the secondary beer tasted better, and 13% preferred the flavor of the primary only beer. In terms of mouthfeel, this is another one that I thought would just, I don't know how it would make any difference, but as I started to think about, the impact of that trub and all of the stuff that's contained in trub, maybe this would be kind of a telling component of the survey. 50% thought the secondary beer had a little bit more body than the primary only beer, while 38% found no difference between them, and 13% thought the primary only beer had a fuller body. Overall, 50% preferred the mouthfeel of the secondary transferred beer. 38%, which is a difference of 1, I believe, thought there was no difference, and 13% thought the primary only beer had better mouthfeel. So in terms of overall preference, 50% of tasters reported they preferred the secondary only or the secondary transferred beer. 25% preferred the primary only beer, and the remaining 25% thought they were way too similar to determine a preference. So that was the experiment. It was a fun one. I do kind of regret not having done a triangle test in that one, only because I really do want to know if people can actually distinguish a difference and not just, quote, taste a difference because we're telling them that they are different.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that one. I mean, we have 8 people that said they preferred the secondary, 4 preferred primary, and 4 thought they were too similar to tell a difference. What are the odds that the 4 extra that secondary got was just a guess? I'm inclined to think maybe pretty high, so I really want to see this one redone. Now, I remember, I think I came to this article, a bit after it had been published, and I remember just looking at those pictures and being amazed. I don't know if at the time I was probably not doing secondary, but I probably still in the back of my mind thought it maybe produces a clearer beer. And just looking at your 2 pictures there, I mean, those are the exact same.
Yeah, sometimes the observational data, which is why we take so many photos, is sometimes it's more interesting than the actual sensory analysis that we run. And in this one, this was before I was fining with gelatin. In this one, the fact that the beers were as similar as they were in terms of appearance, I was really surprised by that because I expected to see at least some sort of a difference, if not. The secondary batch being a little bit more hazy, which would have confirmed my own bias, right? That by doing the transfer, you're actually stirring crap up that stays in solution longer because of the transfer. And that just didn't seem to be the case. In fact, in my own trials, looking back at my notes, I just couldn't tell a difference which beer was which. In my experience, these beers are exactly the same. That's what I wrote. My own anecdotal evidence is that it really hasn't had a negative impact on my brewing. And that's not to say that staying in primary only has had a positive impact on the quality of my beer, but I can say unequivocally that it has had an impact on the quality of my brewing experience.
Right. I mean, not having to worry about coming back 10 days later and hurrying up to get it in a new vessel, clean a new vessel, clean your old vessel, and then clean that new one once you're wrecking it to a keg. No thanks. And
I will say, I think there's an important point to be made about this whole racking to keg thing. And that is my secondary these days. So nowadays I rack to a keg and after about, honestly, 7 to 10 days of primary fermentation, I cold crash. That beer is done fermenting. I cold crash it. I fine it with gelatin, and then it's in a keg, and I do let it sit for a few days before I start drinking. And so in many ways, that could be referred to as a secondary vessel. I'm just not so sure that the purpose is laid out for why it's important to rack to a secondary, at least when I got into brewing in 2003, are necessarily applicable in this day and age. What I struggle to understand is where that came from. And besides we talked about replicating professional breweries and stuff like that, but what was the reason for it? Did people really believe that by doing that, it would make a clearer beer? And if that's the case, I want to know the mechanics behind that. What about that process makes for a clearer beer, except for the fact that there's a smaller cake of junk at the bottom? How does that impact clarity at all?
I'm at a loss.
Yeah, you know what? As am I, and it's just one of those cool things that this type of experimentation can kind of help us to better understand. So I'm glad to do this, and I'm looking forward to do it again. All right, so we've already kind of spoken a little bit about our processes. People, I'm sure, have taken away that we aren't using secondaries very much anymore today. But there are those instances where maybe we would.
Yeah, personally, for 99% of the beers I brew, I'm fermenting in a primary only and then transferring from the primary to a keg after cold crashing. The only exceptions that I've done in the last year are a few sour beers that I've done, which I transferred to a smaller glass carboy for bulk aging. Most of those are actually still sitting there and have been for probably over 12 months. And really, like you, I don't really understand the arguments that secondary would aid in clearing the beer at all. But I'm also open to the idea that it could be good for bulk aging on wood, could be good for re-fermentation of fruit. But I'd like to see that tested out.
Yeah, definitely. I actually can't think of any instances today. I know it's kind of a softball and a setup, but I I cannot think of an instance in this day and age where I would ever use a secondary fermenter. Now, I don't want people to hear me say that just because, I write these articles for this silly website and take it as gospel. I'm a weird person. I don't mind taking the risks of potentially having to dump a batch. And I hate racking to a secondary for all the reasons you mentioned earlier, preparing a secondary carboy, cleaning the primary one, setting up the whole racking, siphon system. It's all annoying to me. And so I never do it. I've made my experiences here. Some of the anecdote that I mentioned earlier. I've made multiple sour beers that I've aged for longer than 14 months. One of them went 18 months in the primary vessel. I still have some bottles. If you're going to HomebrewCon and you are a member of Milk the Funk, I'm planning to have some of those bottles with me. Flanders Red Ales and some blonde sours. These beers both set in primary on their original yeast cakes, both Sack, Brett, and Bugs, for over 14 months. One of them, again, was 18 months at the time that I kegged them, and not a single person ever commented that there was anything off about them. Now, that doesn't mean they're perfect beers. I certainly don't think they are, but there's nothing about them that would suggest that there was any autolyzed yeast. Now, there's an argument to be made for Brettanomyces and the impact that it has, or how it can sort of shield against the negative aspects of autolysis, and I think that's really neat as well. But I've also made some clean beers. I made a Russian Imperial Stout about 2 years ago. I threw one together, and first time I'd ever made a beer that big. I'm not really much into big beers. And I thought, you know what, I'm just gonna let this thing go. And after, what was it? I think I left it in primary for about 6.5, 7 months, which some people say is kind of the limit, but that's what I did. And that beer came out perfectly fine. No off flavors to think of. People really enjoyed it. Where that beer went wrong is that I added a unsanitized wood honeycomb to it, and that soured it very quickly, and that wasn't intentional. So I ended up dumping all of those bottles. But still, the beer right out of the keg was fantastic, and I really enjoyed that. I've done it a lot with some other beers as well. I've made over 500 batches of beer, probably 450 of which were never transferred to a secondary. And I've yet to be able to, beers that have done well in competition, beers that I've really enjoyed and that my neighbors and my friends have really enjoyed. I've never gotten feedback of autolysis or off flavors that I would say are a function or a product of leaving it in primary only.
I think suffice to say, neither of us are strongly for racking to secondary.
Yeah, but at the same time, if somebody wants to do that, or if you want to recommend doing it, I don't care. It's your brewing. And I guess that leads us into our final question. Jake, if somebody were to come to you and they were to say, man, I really want to get into brewing. I bought this kit. There's these instructions here. Can you go over them and let me know if there's anything that it's missing or that I don't need to do? What do you say?
This is one of, I think, the rare instances where I would, pretty strongly say just skip that secondary. Let it ferment out in primary, rack it to your bottling bucket or your keg, and package that beer.
This is one of those ones where I think I'm right there with you, though this is probably harkens back to the fact that I cut my chops in the days of secondary as necessary. When somebody comes to me and they've bought a kit that has that secondary fermenter, that's usually a 5-gallon glass carboy, right? And they've got that and they paid for it and it's all there. Sometimes I've been inclined to say, hey, check it out. If you want to give it a shot, maybe do it just exactly by the rules so you know what it feels like, you get a feel for it. Don't buy into that as being a completely, necessary aspect of the brewing process, but maybe next batch, skip that. See what you think. See if it's a little bit easier. See if the trade-off, if there is any, is worth the cut in time from brewing, and you don't have to clean as much and all of that stuff. So I do see, I think there's value sometimes in trying these conventional methods that may not really make much of a difference. But at the same time, if someone's saying, is it necessary? My pretty ardent answer is no. I don't think it's necessary.
So for the homebrew hipsters out there that want to, do the nostalgia of what people were doing in the 80s and 90s, you'd recommend doing the secondary?
If their goal is basically to replicate what was going on in the early days of homebrewing, absolutely, that's what you're going to want to do. So I guess that brings us to the end of our talk on racking to a secondary. I know there was no triangle test that we went over, but we absolutely do plan to revisit this variable in the future. And I'm looking forward to chatting with probably with you about it, Jake, on the podcast.
All right, man. Sounds good.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks again for listening. We love you for it. Remember, don't forget to head over to greatfermentations.com/brewlosophy to enter the Homebrew for Life giveaway, an opportunity to win a Blickman Brewing Brew Easy setup in the size of your choice, as well as 15 years of homebrewing ingredients. It's an awesome giveaway. Don't forget to do that. If you're looking for other ways to support us, you can head over to brewlosophy.com/support. And don't forget to check out the rewards you can get for helping us out at patreon.com/brewlosophy. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to keep up with what we're doing. Please send show feedback and your Brew and A questions to Marshall@brewlosophy.com. Cheers to all of our sponsors. We really do appreciate you guys being around. We'll be back in a few weeks with the next episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then,
think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no